and yet there are different races of people. Well, in this session we're going to start from the Bible to show that we are all descendants of Adam and Eve, and that real science confirms that. And it's easy to understand how there are different people groups, not different races. It's because of the Tower of Babel that split up the human gene pool. And did you know that every human being is actually the same skin color? It's a matter of how much or how little that you have. You see, there are answers to these questions, and that really helps skeptics understand the Bible's history is true, and therefore the gospel based in that history is true. One of the questions I get asked over and over again, before we even discuss that, talking about the so-called races, one of the questions I get asked over and over again goes something like this. Well, if God made Adam and Eve, and they had Cain and Abel, where do all the people come from then? The question is often asked this way: where did Cain get his wife? In fact, I think I've been asked that question 5,342,355 times over the past 30 years. It doesn't matter what country I'm in or where I'm at, people seem to have this question, well, where did Cain get his wife? You know, how do people come about if we all go back to Adam and Eve? So let me give you a little test to start with here. Can you marry your relation? Yes, no, probably, only after counselling. And the reason I ask that, because there are people that say, now, you're not allowed to marry your relative. Well, I got news for you. If you don't marry your relative, you don't marry a human, then you've really got a problem. You see, if we all go back to Adam and Eve, it means we're all related, right? See, Jesus Christ stepped into history. The Son of God stepped into history to be Jesus, the God-man, to be our relative, to be a descendant of Adam, to die for the descendants of Adam. He became our relative. And so, from the perspective of one man and one woman, obviously, we're all related to each other, whether you like it or not. You're related to me, I'm related to you. By the way, it makes a big difference when you see someone you don't like and you say to yourself, huh, they're my relative. It does make a big difference. Well, let's understand this from a biblical perspective. First of all, 1 Corinthians 15:45, Paul tells us the first man, Adam. There's one man, Adam. Genesis chapter 3, verse 20, Eve was given that name because she was to be the mother of all the living. Not some of the living, all the living. It's very obvious from Scripture that there was one man, one woman to start with, Adam and Eve. Acts 17, verse 26, Paul, talking to the Greeks, said God made of one blood all nations are meant for to dwell on the face of the earth. We're all related. We all go back to one man, one woman. Well, in that case, if we have Adam and Eve, and then the Bible tells us about Cain and Abel and Seth, where did Cain get his wife? I was at a restaurant in London once, and the chef found out that we were there because we were running a creation seminar near the restaurant. And he heard that we believed the Bible, and so he came over to talk to us. And he said, "You believe the Bible?" I said, "Yes, I believe the Bible." He said, "I don't believe the Bible." I said, "You don't?" He said, "No." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Well, the Bible says God made Adam and Eve, and then there were Cain and Abel. Where do all the people come from then?" And I said, "Oh, well, Genesis chapter 5, verse 4 says Adam had sons and daughters." And he looked at me and he said, "Oh, I never read that far." By the way, that's a problem with a lot of people. They don't read that far. They don't read enough. But there it is. Adam had sons and daughters. So get rid of all these misconceptions and outside ideas and so on. If there was Adam and Eve and they had sons and daughters, only one man and one woman to start with, and if marriage is one man for one woman, which was what the Bible clearly teaches, then originally, notice I said originally, brothers married who? Sisters. Now, as soon as I say that, people say, "Now, wait a minute. You know, you're not allowed to marry a relative." Oh, wait a minute, we are all related. Now, it is true that today you don't marry a close relative, right? We don't marry a close relative today. But Abraham was married to his half-sister, and that wasn't a problem. So why wasn't it a problem back then, but it's a problem today? And actually, it wasn't until the time of Moses in Leviticus that God said no longer can close relations marry. And see, so let's understand this, and you know, a little bit about genetics just helps us understand even further, although the answer's already there, if you think about it. When God made Adam and Eve, they were perfect. Everything was very good. But Adam sinned. And as a result of Adam's sin, rebelling against God, Adam, if you disobey, you will surely, what? die. So God withdraws some of that sustaining power. So now we run down, the whole universe runs down, we run down, we die. Our body dies. You see, because God no longer holds everything together perfectly, what happens now is that there are mutations, there are mistakes, copying mistakes from one generation to the next, and they keep accumulating more and more over time. Actually, after 6,000 years, we've got a phenomenal number of mistakes in our genes. It's called a genetic load, and it's a real problem. It's a real problem. And so here's the problem today. If you're closely related, you're more likely to inherit the similar mistakes from your parents. And if those mistakes get together with sperm fertilizes egg, there's an increased likelihood of deformities, problems in the offspring. That's why today it's better to marry someone further away in relationship from you. So where one has a bad gene, the other will have a good gene. So the good gene tends to mask the bad gene. And by the way, you can even see the result of that, because if you look around the room, we see people with their eyes a little crooked, a nose a little out of whack, or a chin's a little out of whack. Those mistakes are there. But if you think about this, the further back in history you go towards Adam and Eve, there'd be fewer and fewer mistakes. Adam and Eve were perfect. Their children wouldn't have had that many mistakes. Wouldn't have been a problem for brother to marry sister, provided it was one man for one woman. That's what marriage is all about. But by the time of Moses, God brought in that law for the Israelites that no longer were close relations allowed to marry. And of course today, close relations don't need to marry anyway, because there's so many people. But see, it's very easy to understand that, isn't it? Now, I was saying in one of the other sessions that I was on a radio program once when I answered this question, a Christian radio program actually, and a man called up and said, I'm an atheist, and if you believe that about Cain's wife, that brothers married sisters, that's immoral. Well, that's when I first said to him, you're an atheist. You can't accuse me of being immoral. You don't believe in absolutes, no absolute authority. And you say everyone has a right to their own opinion. How can you decide what's immoral and what's moral? That's your opinion. You can't accuse me of being immoral. And then he said, well, that's incest. And I said, wait a minute. Actually, the word incest is a modern word. Just like the word dinosaur. The word dinosaur was first invented in 1841. Now, the word incest is a modern word. And we put a whole lot of things under incest, some of which have always been immoral, that's true, but not brother and sister marriage in the context of biblical history and marriage being one man for one woman. And I even said to this person, I said, you believe in evolution, you don't believe in God, right? So for you, marriage is whatever you want to make it to be. You can define it any way you want, with anything or anyone or whatever you want, right? And you think we've got a problem? No, you're the one with the problem. But you know, it really is easy to answer where Cain got his wife. And it seems this has been such a big stumbling block for so many people around the world. But the answer's already there in the Bible anyway. Read Genesis 5:4, Adam had sons and daughters. Read about the doctrine of marriage, just one man for one woman. The law against close intermarriage for the Israelites didn't come till the time of Moses. Paul tells us Adam was the first man. Genesis 3 tells us Eve was the mother of all the living. Do you realize it's all there if we study God's word? And of course, an understanding of genetics and mutations helps us understand even a little more, doesn't it? And helps throw some light on all of that. Well, that's easy to understand. Okay, what seems to be a little harder to understand is then, what about all the so-called races? You notice I keep saying so-called races? Because I want you to think about this for a moment. If we're all descendants of Adam and Eve, then how many races of people biologically are there? Only one. There can't be any races, because we're all descendants of one man and one woman. Well, you know, before we can talk about this, then instead of talking about different races, I'm going to be talking about there's different people groups within the one race. And those different people groups have some distinct characteristics, that's true. American Indians, Fijians, you can tell them Australian and Aboriginal, and so it goes on. So how could that come about? How can we understand that? And to do that, we're going to do a little basic course in genetics. Now, some of you are sitting there saying, I've never studied genetics. I didn't even like genetics. Look, if you're married and had kids, you study genetics. It's as simple as that. And be assured, I do things from a big picture perspective, basic principles. It is so much more technical than what I'm going to do for you here, but the basic principles apply. And it also is something that teaches us you don't have to be a PhD scientist to talk about these basic principles. When you read Genesis chapter 1, the Bible tells us that God created the animals and plants after their kind. The phrase after his kind, after their kind, concerning the creation of the animal kinds and so on in Genesis 1, is used there 10 times. God created after his kind, after their kind. The implication is that each kind reproduces its own kind. Now, before we go on, the Hebrew word for kind in Genesis 1, we believe equates in the classification system that we use in classifying animals and plants, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. We believe, for many reasons, that the word kind equates to the family level of classification in most instances, to the family level. Some people think that the Bible is not scientifically accurate because they think that where it states after his kind or after their kind means that the Bible's saying animals don't change. The Bible's not saying animals don't change. It's just saying each kind is going to produce its own kind. That's the implication there. In fact, Charles Darwin, as he sailed around the world in his boat, the Beagle, one of the things he noticed was that animals change. Let me ask you a question. Do animals change? The answer is yes, animals change. Dogs change. What do dogs change into? Dogs change into dogs, exactly. What do cats change into? Cats change into cats. What do elephants change into? Elephants change into what? Alpha, and so it goes on. You can have different species of elephants, your stegomastodons, your mastodons, and the Indian elephants, your African elephants, dogs, you've got dingoes, wolves, coyotes, jackal, fennec, foxes, but dogs always remain dogs, cats always remain cats. The secular world makes this statement: the origin of the domestic dogs from wolves has been established, suggesting a common origin from a single gene pool for all dog populations. So they're saying all the domestic dogs came from something like wolves. And of course, wolves and all of the other dogs, like dingoes, etc., are all of the same family anyway, so which means they're all of the one kind. They're saying something like this gave rise over time to even these, and eventually even these. Now, some people say, well, how could that give rise to that? That looks like a dog. We're not sure what that looks like. And actually, what I would say is this. Some people say, isn't that evolution when you go from that to that? Evolution? No, that's a downhill process. Evolution really teaches an uphill process. You know, getting more and more information and getting better and better and so on. And what we have here is a loss of information. In fact, it's probably a bad analogy, but I sometimes use an analogy like this. You know, if you take motor cars, okay? Now, we have a little Kia Rio. Sorry if you sell Kias, but it's an older Kia Rio. It's sort of, I look on it as the poodle of the car world. For this reason, that if you take one little thing off, it doesn't work. Now, if you have a Rolls Royce, you have all these optional extras and you can take them off and it still works as a car, right? So the wolf is like the Rolls Royce of the dog, and the poodle is like the Kia Rio. Okay, it's down there. Now, actually, when you get to the poodle, see, if you go beyond a poodle, that's it. I mean, that's the end of the line in dogs, basically, right there. And some people say to me, well, did God make poodles? Well, God made the original dog and said everything was very good, so there were no poodles to start with. Actually, poodles only exist because of sin. Remember I said how those mutations occur now? And see, in a poodle, like most of our purebred dogs, you've got all these mutations or mistakes. Really, a poodle is a great example of talking about a sin-cursed world. So will poodles be in heaven? Think about it. There's going to be no sin in heaven, everything will be perfect. So you can't have a poodle in heaven, obviously. All right, let's go on here. Now, we don't know how many dogs God made originally. Let's say he made 2 dogs, okay? And they got married and had kids, they got married and had kids, and they got married and had kids, and eventually end up with lots of dogs. Now, in genetics, we use a convention. We label genes with capital letters, big A, big B, little b. It's much more complicated than this, just basic principles. And the capital letters represent dominant genes, the little letters represent recessive genes. And so here we have a male and female. Let's say a male and female here. This represents 2 dogs, let's say something like the wolf. And then, in sexual reproduction, you get 1 set of genes from the male, 1 from the female, and so you could get this combination here. And then you could get these other combinations that you can see here. Now, if you look at this, look at that one that's got 2 big A's, 2 big B's, 2 big C's. Notice something. This one has a different combination of information to the parents, so it's going to look a little different to the parents. But because these parents are dogs, what is this one here going to be? A dog. But it's going to look different. Does it have new information? No, no new information. It does have something new. Do you know what it's got new? A new combination of information. Okay? And it's actually got less information than the parents. You know why it's got less information? Less variability. It doesn't have the little a, little b, little c. This one here, this represents, well, this is what I like to use to represent, be analogous to a poodle. Little a, little a, little b, little b, little c, little c. See, how do we breed our purebred breeds of dogs? Oh, this one has a short nose, this one has a short nose, let's breed these together. Let's eliminate all the genes for long nose and get the short nose genes all together in one dog. And that's how we get our purebred varieties, if you like. Now, I want you to look at this. If you breed a poodle with a poodle, what are you going to get? Poodle. Pretty sad. That's it. Now, could you start with poodles on their own, breeding poodles with poodles, and eventually get back to a wolf? No, you can't, because you know what? You're missing the big A's, big B's, big C's here. See, it's got less information. Now, if you start with the wolves again, theoretically, could you eventually get poodles? And the answer is what? Yes. Aha. Now, how much information is there in our genes? How much variability has God put in there? Well, look. The number of atoms estimated to be in the entire universe is this number, 1 followed by 80 zeros. That's 10 to the 80th power. That's a big number, the number of atoms estimated in the universe. If you took one man and one woman from this audience, do you know how many children you could have potentially without having two with the same combination of information just from the variability in your genes right now? It's been estimated at this number. That number is so big. You think you've got a big family? That's a big family. I mean, that's zillions. It's incomprehensible. People, here's what I want you to understand. From a Darwinian evolution perspective, the secularists believe we start with no information, matter, that somehow produces a language system and information, DNA, and over millions of years you get zillions of bits of new information to produce bigger and bigger pools of information to get all the different kinds of animals and plants. The Bible tells us God made the kinds to start with, so he made the big pools of information to start with, and I'm going to say to you what we observe over time is redistribution of information and a loss of information, the opposite of evolution. Let's illustrate it this way. Noah's Ark, 2 of each kind, 7 of some, but 2 of every kind, land-dwelling, air-breathing animal went on board Noah's Ark. So dogs, there would have been 2 on Noah's Ark. If they're all the one kind, the one family, 2 dogs on Noah's Ark. They come off Noah's Ark and you end up with lots of dogs again. But they're not going to stay together. They're going to split up and move away from each other. And when you think about all the incredible variability that God already put there in the genes, what's going to happen? Over time, some information is lost, recombination of information, different combinations, and you'll end up with different species forming from the original gene pool. That's not evolution. It's the opposite of evolution. See, evolution requires new information. This is just operating on the information that's already there, and over time, natural selection, you heard of natural selection? See, Darwin was right about natural selection. Darwin was right about speciation. We see adaptation, but it's not evolution. It's the opposite of evolution. What's taught in the public school textbooks as evidence for evolution is actually the opposite of evolution when you understand it. Let me explain it this way. Here's a dog that has an SNL gene, another dog with an SNL gene. These are the dogs on Noah's Ark. S for short hair, L for long hair, SNL together give a medium hair length dog. So they have an offspring that inherits one S gene from one and one S gene from the other. It has short hair. It looks different from the parents. Has it got something new? A new combination of information from information already there. Okay? Now, you can get another offspring that inherits an S from one and an L from one and looks like the parents. And then there's one other combination, and what's that? An L and an L. Well, you have a long-haired dog. You say, well, that's got something new. It's got long hair. No, it's a new combination of information that was already there. That's what's new. Now, you imagine, and this is really to help us understand what's called natural selection, speciation, adaptation. It's much more complicated than this, but just some basic principles here, big picture. The dogs move towards a cold climate. So those with short hair and medium hair get cold. And they die. And now you're only left with dogs that have L genes, long hair, who can only ever produce offspring that have L genes. They can never produce offspring with medium hair or short hair again because they've lost the S gene. They've lost information. Imagine dogs move towards a hot climate. In a hot climate, those with long hair and medium hair overheat. They die. And now you're left with dogs with only S genes who on their own will only ever produce short-haired dogs. And so you can imagine over time, with redistribution of information, new combinations of information, loss of information, you eventually form lots of species of dogs, and the kids in our schools are taught, and that's evolution. They use the word evolution for that, because the word evolution just means change. But they're really meaning that's a mechanism for one kind into another. People, when you truly understand this, if our kids were taught the truth about this, they would understand, but this is the opposite of evolution. Absolutely. And by the way, what we're seeing totally confirms what the Bible says. God created kinds, pools of information to start with. See, the Bible's true. Now, what I want to do, I want to apply that to the humankind. And so I want you to think about this. God made Adam and Eve, and then by the time of the flood, there were 8 people that survived on that boat, Noah's Ark, Noah and his family, and they came off the ark, and numbers increased again. Well, how will we get distinct people group with distinguishing characteristics like the American Indians, Fijians, Hawaiians, Eskimos, Australian Aborigines? People groups that have dark skin, people groups with light skin, and so on. Something in history would have to split up the human gene pool, like we sort of did with dogs, and separate them from each other. Something. Is there anything you can think of in human history that could split up the human gene pool?
After the flood, Noah and his family gave thanks and offered sacrifices to God for preserving them. God told Noah to go and multiply and fill the earth. Noah's family flourished and multiplied, but they did not spread all over the earth. Instead, they moved down from the mountains of Ararat and settled in the plain of Shinar and dreamed of building a great city. Come, let us build a city and a tower to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. God, the creator of the heavens and the earth, looked down upon them and saw the city and the tower they were building. They are united and speak the same language. Now nothing they imagine to do will be impossible for them. So God went down and confused their language, so they could not understand each other. And God scattered them over the face of the earth, and they stopped building the city. They left Babel by foot, by cart, and by boat. Because of the language barriers, each family group became isolated and developed distinct physical traits and cultures. But all came from the 3 sons of Noah, so they all share the same genes and all share the same promise of the Savior, the seed which God promised to Adam in the Garden of Eden.
And you see, that's really it. That's it. I mean, we could all go home now, right? It's a Tower of Babel. God gave different languages. Genesis 10, the Table of Nations. The family groups moved away from each other according to their language groups and so on. And as a result of what happens in regard to which genes moved in which direction and which combinations survived best and loss of information, other things, you end up with distinct people groups. It's very easy to understand. It's not hard. The Bible has the answer right there. Now, let's delve into that in a bit more detail. In 1859, Darwin published a book that in many ways has changed our modern world. And the title began this way: In the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, and the rest of the title of the book was this, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Now, the Origin of Species book was primarily about animals. It wasn't about man. But it's very interesting that this book that talks about the different races and so on, and the Origin of Species, at the end of the Origin of Species, Darwin says this. He says, in the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researchers. Psychology will be based on a new foundation, that of the necessary acquirement of each mental power and capacity by gradation. And he goes on and says, light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. In other words, what Darwin was saying in the Origin of Species, I'm going to apply this to man. You see, in Victorian England, it was hard enough coming out and saying, you know, the animals evolved and trying to convince the culture that. Imagine if you came right out immediately and said people evolved. No, he waited until the evolutionary ideas sort of permeated the culture, and then a number of years later, he published the book, The Descent of Man, where he applied it to man. And as a result of this, what happened? Well, the late Stephen Jay Gould from Harvard University made this statement. He said, biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. Here's something I want us to understand. Evolution is not the cause of racism. Sin is the cause of racism. But when you're taught an idea that there are lower races and higher races and primitive races, and you think you might be one of the advanced races, you can see how it could actually fuel a type of racism and prejudice if you think that you're in a higher race than somebody else. And that's exactly what Darwinian evolution did. You know, in Darwin's book, Descent of Man, and I'll explain it to you in a moment, he says, at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. At the same time, he talks about the apes will no doubt be exterminated, and then the break between man and his nearest allies will then be wider, for it will intervene between a man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, even then the Caucasian and some ape, as well as a baboon, instead of now between the Negro, Australian Aborigine and the gorilla. What does that all mean? Tell you what it means. He's saying this. You've got the apes back here and the Australian Aborigines here, fairly close to the apes, and people from Africa, he's saying too, and then the Caucasians over here. And he says, when these savage races are gone, then the gap between the apes and the Caucasians is going to be wider. How is that for fueling racism and prejudice?
All right. Good explanation of genetics. Real simple, easy for me to understand, and how the natural selection, because of the availability of the gene pool, has made the variations seem like to be evolution, when all they are is actually adaptation because of the amount of gene pool that's available. All right, any question or anything that he went through? Okay, I didn't have anything particular spelled out, but on the question part of it, group discussion questions, is natural selection the same as evolution explained? Here's what he's got in the teacher's book. No, natural selection is actually opposite of evolution. Organisms best suited to their environment survive, while the others die out. This results in a loss of information in a population, and only works on characteristics and genes that already exist. The process does not result in new information. All right. Why is it incorrect to say God created all the species that we have today? He just went over this. God created kinds of animals, horse kind, elephant kind, dog kind, cat kind, etc. These original animals had great genetic variety, which would express itself in future generations and allow the offspring to adapt to many different environments around the world. Specification has occurred as populations have become isolated and lost certain genes. All right, and then lastly, can you explain how all the different people groups arose? If Adam and Eve had a mixture of light-colored genes and dark-colored genes, then their descendants would have a wide range of skin color from very light to very dark, with most people somewhere between, as seen in the world today. Adam and Eve likely possessed genetic variation for eye shape and other distinguishing characteristics as well. As people migrated from Babel, different groups became isolated from others and likely married only within their language group, that certain genetic pool. Each group carried a set of physical characteristics as determined by their genes. As they intermarried, certain characteristics began to dominate due to the group's small pool of genes. Over time, different people groups displayed distinct physical characteristics. For example, Asians typically have almond-shaped eyes, dark hair, and middle to brown skin, whereas Europeans have round eyes and fair-colored hair and skin. And so not evolution at all. And I like the way that he put it. It's a lack of information or less information that makes us look the way we do, that makes animals look the way that they do. Dogs was his role, but he mentioned elephants as well. So depending on what is available, that's what's going to be passed from generation to generation. That's why a lot of times children from the same parents look a lot alike, or you'll find that one who looks totally different. And then someone says, well, that's the mailman's child, right? And actually it's just because of genetic, that the parents have genes within them and a capacity for that big A, big B, little c to play into, that makes the variation. So it's a good lesson, good discussion. All right, anyone? I will get into our business meeting at this time.